You think monsters hide in dark alleys? No, they wear expensive tailored suits, pour vintage wine, and smile brightly in family portraits. That phone call at 1:47 in the morning did not just wake me from a light sleep. It awakened a predator inside a woman he mistook for a harmless grandmother. He thought he could break my 19-year-old grandson's wrist, but he forgot one absolute rule. Never corner a mother wolf. Listen closely. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Amelia Porter. I am 49 years old, and I make my living hunting down ghosts in the digital ether. As a senior data risk analyst at Ethelgard Security Solutions, my days and nights are spent tracking corporate espionage, exposing offshore money laundering schemes, and tearing apart firewalls built by very expensive, very arrogant men. I deal in cold, hard facts. Emotion is a dangerous liability in my line of work, and over the years I have learned to carve it out of my chest with surgical precision. It was nearly 2 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. The glow of my 4 curved monitors cast long, harsh shadows across the walls of my home office. I was deep into a forensic audit, swimming through thousands of lines of corrupt code, when a sudden sound shattered the heavy, oppressive silence of the house. It was a ringtone. Not the sleek, modern chime of my current smartphone, but a jarring, metallic, polyphonic melody coming from the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. My hands froze over the keyboard. My heart skipped a solitary, painful beat. That sound belonged to an ancient, battered flip phone. It was my late husband's phone. He passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. I had kept the line active and the phone charged out of a stubborn, quiet grief that I absolutely refused to show the world. But nobody called that number anymore. Nobody except one specific person under one very specific set of circumstances. I slowly pulled the heavy drawer open, my eyes narrowing at the glowing green screen illuminating the darkness. I snatched the device, pressed the answer button, and brought the cold plastic to my ear. "Grandpa, my stepfather twisted my wrist, but Mom will not believe me." The voice on the other end was trembling, fractured by excruciating pain and raw terror. It was Leo, my 19-year-old grandson. He was a brilliant college sophomore who was supposed to be sound asleep in his mother's sprawling, multi-million-dollar suburban mansion in Colorado. Instead, he was crying his breaths, coming in short, panicked gasps that echoed terribly through the receiver. If an ordinary person had picked up that phone and heard those words, they would have assumed the absolute worst about the boy's mental state. They would have thought the poor kid was having a violent psychotic break, completely hallucinating and desperately calling a dead man for salvation. I am completely certain that is exactly what Julian, his shiny, flawless, wealthy stepfather, thought as he stood right outside Leo's locked bedroom door, listening to the boy's frantic pleas. Julian probably smirked. He probably felt a surge of smug satisfaction, truly believing his victim had finally cracked under the psychological pressure. But Julian was a fool. Leo was not hallucinating. He was perfectly lucid. Calling this dead number and asking for Grandpa was a duress code. It was a strict, unbreakable protocol I had drilled into his head years ago, back when I first noticed the subtle, terrifying shifts in his mother's behavior. I taught him that code for one singular purpose: to signal a life-threatening emergency, to call for immediate extraction without alerting the enemy standing just inches away. I did not speak a single word. I simply breathed heavily into the receiver, letting the steady rhythm of my breath signal that I was there. I was listening, and the line was completely secure. "He is right outside the door," Leo whispered rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. "I was looking for a textbook I left in his study. I tripped and knocked over a heavy rug. I found a false back in his floor safe. It was left open just a crack. There was a hidden encrypted hard drive inside. Before I could even stand up, he caught me." I could hear Leo swallow hard, fighting back a desperate sob. "He did not just grab my arm, Grandma. He dropped his entire weight. He snapped my arm back using some kind of professional martial arts lock. He broke my wrist. I heard the bone crack. And then, before I could even scream, he started shouting. He threw himself against the heavy mahogany desk and pretended I was the one viciously attacking him. My fingers tightened around the ancient plastic casing of the phone so hard the battery cover groaned. He told Mom I was high on synthetic drugs. Leo choked out, his voice dropping to a raspy whisper. He told her I went completely crazy and tried to rob him, and she believed him. She always believes him now. She locked me in this room. She told me through the door that they are waiting for the police to come take me away to a locked rehab facility. My daughter Clara. She was 33 years old. She was not a malicious mother, but she was entirely a ghost of the vibrant, fiercely independent woman I had raised. Over the past 3 years, Julian had systematically and ruthlessly dismantled her reality. He gaslit her, relentlessly isolating her from her close friends, her former colleagues, and especially from me. Much more terrifyingly, he was controlling her fragile mind with a steady, daily drip of high-grade sedatives that he confidently convinced her were holistic dietary supplements from his own medical startup. She was nothing but a hollow puppet, now nodding along to whatever twisted narrative her husband spun, entirely too heavily medicated to see the vicious predator sleeping right beside her. Most grandmothers would weep openly. Most would fall to their knees, panic dial 911, or scream loudly at the utter, agonizing injustice of it all. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are a foolish luxury reserved only for peacetime, and as of 1:47 in the morning, my family was officially at war. Listen to me very carefully, I said softly, my voice devoid of any warmth, sharp as shattered glass. Do not fight them. When the police arrive, let them take you into custody. Do not say another word about the encrypted drive. Comply completely with their orders. I am on my way. I hung up the phone. I did not bother changing out of my dark slacks and black turtleneck. I walked swiftly across the room and opened my heavy steel tactical drawer. I completely bypassed the old family photo albums and reached straight for my specialized military-grade encrypted data extraction kit. I shoved it securely into my leather satchel, grabbed my car keys, and walked out into the freezing pitch-black night. I climbed into my heavy reinforced SUV. The powerful engine roared to life with a low, aggressive growl that perfectly mirrored the sudden, cold, calculated rage pumping aggressively through my veins. Julian thought he was playing a simple domestic game of dominance. He thought he had effortlessly outsmarted a naive teenager and a drugged, helpless housewife. He had absolutely no idea that he had just awakened a woman who spent her entire professional life dismantling sophisticated cyber threats, tearing down vast empires of lies, and utterly destroying men who mistakenly thought they were untouchable. I threw the gear into drive. The heavy tires screeched violently against the freezing asphalt. Within seconds, I was tearing down the completely empty winding highway, pushing the glowing speedometer well past 90 miles per hour. The absolute darkness of the night swallowed the long road ahead, but my vision had never been clearer. I was coming for him. The heavy iron gates of the isolated Colorado estate loomed ahead at exactly 2:45 in the morning. The massive house was a grotesque monument to Silicon Valley excess, all brutalist concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered zero warmth against the freezing mountain air. I parked my heavy vehicle slightly askew on the pristine gravel driveway, intentionally leaving the driver's side door open to sell the illusion of blind panic. Before my boots even touched the ground, I initiated a complete physical and psychological override. I dropped the rigid, calculated posture of a seasoned data risk analyst. I rounded my shoulders, let my hands tremble slightly, and forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I became exactly what the enemy expected to see: a frantic, emotionally volatile, harmless grandmother under 50 who was entirely out of her depth. I hammered my fists against the massive custom oak door. It swung open almost immediately. Julian stood there, framed by the warm, perfectly calibrated ambient lighting of his grand foyer. He did not look like a man who had just violently assaulted a teenager. He wore a plush cashmere sweater, his expensive watch catching the light, his dark hair perfectly tousled. His face was arranged in a masterful display of tired paternal concern. He was the absolute picture of a successful, composed tech entrepreneur dealing with a tragic domestic burden. "Emilia, please come inside," he said, his voice smooth and heavily laced with manufactured pity. "I am so sorry you had to drive all the way out here in the middle of the night. We are dealing with a very volatile situation." I pushed past him, letting out a perfectly timed gasp of distress. "Where is he? What on earth happened, Julian? The phone call made absolutely no sense." Julian sighed, running a manicured hand over his jaw. "Leo is experiencing a severe rebellious episode. I caught him trying to break into my private office. When I confronted him, he became violently erratic. He is clearly under the influence of some very potent synthetic narcotics. We are currently waiting for a private medical transport. He desperately needs a professional medical intervention, Emilia. It breaks my heart, but we have to be strong for Clara." Right on cue, Clara drifted out from the shadowy hallway of the master wing. I felt a sharp, icy spike of genuine fury pierce my chest, but I kept my face frozen in an expression of helpless maternal worry. My 33-year-old daughter looked like a reanimated corpse. Her beautiful eyes were dull and unfocused, her pupils reduced to tiny pinpricks, despite the dim lighting. Her gait was sluggish, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She was clearly heavily sedated, forcibly maintained in a chemical fog by the proprietary neuroenhancers manufactured by Julian's very own biomedical startup. He was literally drugging her into absolute submission, turning her into a compliant phantom in her own home. "Mom?" Clara mumbled her words, slurring together as she stared blankly at the wall somewhere over my left shoulder. "Leo was very bad tonight. Julian is just trying to protect us." "I know, sweetheart, I know," I cooed, rushing over to stroke her hair while simultaneously cataloging the terrifying depth of her chemical dependency. "Let me just see him. Let me talk some sense into the boy." Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed, assessing me, calculating the risk. But looking at my trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, his massive ego won. He nodded magnanimously and unlocked the heavy guest room door. I rushed inside. Leo was huddled in the corner of the lavish room, clutching his swelling right arm against his chest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with genuine terror. I threw myself onto the floor beside him, wrapping my arms around his shaking shoulders in a dramatic sobbing embrace. "Oh, my poor boy, what have you done?" I cried loudly, ensuring my voice carried through the open doorway to where Julian was undoubtedly listening. Under the cover of my heavy wool coat and the frantic embrace, Leo pressed a cold, sharp object into the palm of my hand. A standard high-capacity USB drive. I seamlessly slipped it into the hidden inner pocket of my trousers without breaking the rhythm of my fake sobs. While holding him, my eyes locked onto his injured wrist. The bruising was already forming an ugly, dark purple pattern. It was not the chaotic, randomized bruising of a clumsy, physical scuffle. The discoloration was highly concentrated around the radial and ulnar bones, displaying the exact pressure points of a professional, high-torque joint manipulation. It was a textbook Krav Maga wristlock executed with ruthless, calculated precision, meant to snap bone instantly. My mind raced rapidly, updating the threat assessment. Julian was not merely a white-collar con artist playing with pharmaceutical patents. He had advanced tactical combat training. He was a highly disciplined, physically dangerous predator. I stood up, wiping away imaginary tears, and walked back out to the hallway to face the monster. I knew I had to extract Leo immediately. If a private medical team arrived, they would search him, find nothing, but Julian would ensure Leo disappeared into a corrupt psychiatric facility forever. "Julian," I said, letting my voice crack pitifully. "He is terrified. He is completely inconsolable. If the authorities or medics come here tonight, it will be a public spectacle. You know how the neighbors in this exclusive community gossip. The board of directors at your company will certainly hear about the commotion parked outside your estate. It will be a public relations nightmare for your brand." I watched the micro-expressions flash across Julian's handsome face. I had hit the exact pressure point. His reputation, his flawless public image. "Let me take him home to my place for the night. I pleaded, clasping my hands together in a pathetic display of begging. Let me de-escalate this. I will keep him locked in my guest room. He trusts me. Tomorrow, when he is sober and calm, we can quietly arrange for the private rehabilitation center. No sirens, no scandals. Please, Julian, for Clara's sake. He looked at his heavily medicated wife, then back at my pleading, seemingly harmless face. His supreme arrogance blinded him to the trap. He smiled, a cold, benevolent expression that made my stomach turn. You are right, Amelia. A scandal is the last thing Clara needs right now. Take him, but I will be calling first thing in the morning to handle the medical transfer. Thank you, I whispered, bowing my head in fake gratitude. 10 minutes later, Leo was securely buckled into the passenger seat of my vehicle. As I drove away from the opulent fortress, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Julian was standing on the grand porch watching us leave, completely unaware that he had just handed the architect of his absolute destruction the exact weapon needed to ruin his life. My basement is not a typical suburban storage space. It is a fortified, climate-controlled server room built to the exact specifications of the Ethelgard Security Solutions mainframe. The thick walls are lined with industrial soundproofing foam, and the cold air constantly hums with the low, steady vibration of heavy-duty cooling units. I sat Leo down on a small, uncomfortable cot in the corner of the room, handed him a heavy ice pack for his grossly swollen arm, and gave him 2 over-the-counter painkillers. I told him to close his eyes and try to breathe. Then I turned my complete and undivided attention to the small piece of plastic he had smuggled out of hell. I plugged the drive into an isolated, air-gapped terminal. I immediately routed the connection through a complex maze of proxy servers and fired up our proprietary military-grade decryption software. Julian was certainly an intelligent man, but his digital locks were built by commercial software engineers. My specialized tools were originally designed to penetrate state-sponsored cyber defenses and dismantle international espionage networks. It took exactly 47 minutes for the glowing progress bar to reach 100%. The digital firewall cracked open with a silent, invisible fracture, spilling Julian's darkest, most heavily guarded secrets across my massive dual monitors. I leaned in closely, my eyes rapidly scanning the endless rows of encrypted data complex spreadsheets and hidden accounting ledgers. The air in the room seemed to grow substantially colder with every single click of my computer mouse. Julian's glossy, highly publicized biomedical startup was nothing more than a beautifully constructed, devastatingly hollow mirage. On standard public paper, his company was pioneering revolutionary neurological treatments, securing massive rounds of legitimate venture capital funding from naive investors. But the internal shadow accounting told a terrifyingly different story. It was a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The legitimate investor capital was merely being aggressively used to pay off the very early backers, creating a highly convincing illusion of explosive corporate growth. But the true horror lay hidden deep within the offshore routing numbers. The medical startup was entirely operating as a high-volume laundromat for an extremely violent, highly organized crime syndicate based heavily on the East Coast. Tens of millions of dollars of dirty, untraceable street money were being continuously funneled through fake pharmaceutical supply purchases, washed completely clean through the startup's artificially inflated revenue streams, and then paid back out as legitimate taxable corporate dividends. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady during the tense extraction at the sprawling mansion, suddenly clenched into tight, painful fists. I found a highly restricted subfolder containing scanned legal documents and corporate registrations. I opened the master incorporation file and my blood instantly turned to absolute ice. Julian was not listed as the chief executive officer. He was merely registered as an independent advisory board member. The primary legal shareholder, the sole legally responsible director, and the person whose forged and manipulated signature was practically stamped on every single fraudulent tax return and money laundering invoice was Clara. The monstrous fragmented puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind with sickening clarity. The heavy daily sedation. The constant methodical gaslighting. Julian was not just keeping my daughter compliant to feed his twisted domestic ego. He was intentionally, maliciously keeping her chemically lobotomized so she would blindly sign whatever complex legal contracts he casually placed in front of her. He had systematically constructed the perfect corporate firewall, and that firewall was entirely made out of his own wife's flesh and blood. If the federal regulatory agencies ever raided the company headquarters, or if the massive Ponzi scheme eventually collapsed under its own impossible weight, the entire legal devastation would fall squarely on Clara's fragile shoulders. She would be the one facing multiple life sentences in a brutal federal penitentiary. Julian would simply walk away with his lucrative advisory fees, loudly claiming he was completely deceived by a mentally unstable rogue chief executive officer. But there was an even more immediate, undeniably lethal danger. I cross-referenced the crime syndicate's deposit ledgers with another distinct set of hidden, highly encrypted accounts. "Grandma," Leo whispered weakly from the cot, his voice breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the server room. "What did you find in there? Why did he attack me like that just for looking at a computer screen?" I turned my chair to look at my grandson, my expression completely blank. "Because, Leo, you did not just see his corporate files. You saw his personal theft." I turned back to the glowing screens. Julian was greedily skimming off the top. He was quietly diverting small, nearly undetectable percentages of the cartel's washed money into a series of private, completely untraceable accounts, located securely in the Cayman Islands. He was arrogantly stealing from some of the most dangerous, ruthless men on the North American continent. When Leo stumbled into that office and accidentally saw those specific transfer routing numbers, Julian panicked. The violently broken wrist was not a punishment for snooping. It was a desperate, violent act of self-preservation to ensure the boy was totally discredited and categorized as a drug addict before he could ever tell anyone what those specific numbers meant. The immediate instinct of any normal, law-abiding citizen would be to instantly pick up the phone and dial the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But my mind operates entirely on cold risk analysis, and the brutal mathematics of our current situation were crystal clear. If I called the police right now, the authorities would immediately freeze all the corporate assets and arrest the legal head of the company. They would arrest Clara. My daughter would be locked in a cold concrete cell, utterly incapable of defending herself due to the massive amount of drugs actively pumping through her system. Furthermore, the East Coast Syndicate would instantly realize their money was gone and their operation was compromised. They would not patiently wait for a legal court verdict. They would send heavily armed men in the middle of the night to violently silence the entire family. Calling the police was an absolute, undeniable death sentence. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the damning evidence illuminating the dark basement. The law could not possibly save us. The established justice system would only finish the horrific job Julian had started. If I wanted to protect my blood, I could not rely on shiny badges and crowded courtrooms. I had to become something far worse, far more calculating than the man who had destroyed my daughter's life. I had to architect a retaliation so total, so devastatingly thorough, that Julian would actively beg for a federal prison cell just to escape it. I reached forward, placed my hands firmly on my keyboard, and began writing the foundational code for a perfect, inescapable trap. I invited the monster into my home for Sunday dinner. To completely destroy a man like Julian, you must first make him feel utterly invincible. I spent the entire afternoon roasting a heavy cut of prime rib, filling the house with the warm, comforting scent of domestic submission. When the doorbell rang exactly at 6 in the evening, I opened the door wearing a floral apron, my face arranged in a flawless mask of contrite, grandmotherly appeasement. Julian stepped inside, practically radiating smug victory. He wore a tailored navy blazer and held a bottle of overpriced vintage red wine, like a generous peace offering from a conquering king. Clara drifted in beside him, her eyes glassy and incredibly vacant, a chemical ghost haunting my hallway. She barely registered my greeting before sinking heavily into a living room chair. "Thank you for having us," Julian said smoothly, handing me the expensive wine. "I think a quiet family evening is exactly what we need to move past this unfortunate misunderstanding." I forced a warm, deeply apologetic smile. "I overreacted the other night, Julian. Seeing the boy in pain just startled me. I know you only want what is strictly best for this family." We sat down at the heavy oak dining table. Leo sat directly across from his stepfather, his right arm bound securely in a thick white medical cast, his eyes fixed firmly on his porcelain plate. He played his part perfectly, looking thoroughly defeated and entirely broken. Julian sliced into his thick, medium-rare steak with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he controlled the entire universe. Between large bites of meat, he began to pontificate, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Actions have severe consequences, Leo," Julian lectured, pointing his heavy silver fork directly at my grandson. "The world does not care about your youthful rebellion. You have to learn strict discipline. You have to learn respect for the boundaries and the legal structures that generously provide for you." "Yes, sir," Leo mumbled quietly, following my instructions to the letter. While Julian fed his massive ego, chewing his food and delivering his pompous sermon, he was completely oblivious to the silent digital slaughter happening exactly 2 feet beneath his expensive leather shoes. Taped securely to the underside of the dining table directly below where Julian kept his phone in his trouser pocket was a compact military-grade signal interceptor. I had meticulously constructed it using restricted components from my high-security laboratory. While I politely passed the roasted potatoes and offered him a second pour of wine, the hidden device was quietly establishing a localized microscopic cellular network. His highly secured, heavily encrypted smartphone automatically connected to my false tower because the signal was exponentially stronger than the commercial towers outside. In less than 40 seconds, the interceptor effortlessly bypassed his commercial security protocols, extracted his international mobile equipment identity number, and created a flawless, real-time clone of his device on a secure encrypted server sitting directly beneath our feet in my basement. I now had absolute, unrestricted access to every text message, every encrypted email, and every single keystroke he would ever make. I owned his entire digital existence. Later that night, long after I had kissed my heavily sedated daughter goodbye and waved as their luxury vehicle disappeared down the dark street, I descended back into the freezing server room. It was time to tighten the invisible noose. Using the mirrored access from Julian's cloned phone, I infiltrated his highly restricted private network architecture. I began opening a complex web of offshore ghost bank accounts, carefully registering every single one using Julian's exact corporate credentials, his personal identification numbers, and his stolen biometric signature data. Then I quietly initiated the financial bleed. I wrote an automated recursive algorithm designed to siphon money directly from the East Coast Syndicate's primary money laundering pool. But I did not steal massive, obvious sums of cash. That would instantly trigger a loud, chaotic panic. Instead, I programmed the algorithm to shave off tiny micro-percentages. 0.3% here, 0.6% there. Small, seemingly random amounts continuously dripping from the criminal cartel's shadow ledgers straight into the newly minted ghost accounts bearing Julian's name. It was a slow, agonizing digital hemorrhage. The syndicate's brutal forensic accountants would absolutely notice the missing funds during their upcoming monthly audit. And when they frantically followed the digital breadcrumbs, the undeniable trail would lead straight to their arrogant Silicon Valley launderer. However, Julian was highly paranoid. You do not successfully survive stealing from violent criminal cartels without possessing a hyper-vigilant digital perimeter. By Tuesday afternoon, my tracking software alerted me that Julian had detected a tiny, anomalous fluctuation in his internal network traffic. He knew someone had touched the invisible wires of his dark empire. Watching directly through his cloned device, I saw him panic. He bypassed his legitimate corporate tech team and ventured onto a dark web forum, paying a notorious black hat hacker $25,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to aggressively hunt down the unauthorized internet protocol address that had pinged his secure servers. Julian sat in his glass-walled office, desperately waiting for the hired hacker's report. When the encrypted message finally arrived, I read it on my monitor at the exact same second Julian read it on his phone screen. The hacker had successfully traced the intrusion. The hostile internet protocol address belonged to a specific registered local area network. It belonged perfectly to Leo's desktop computer located inside his university dormitory. Julian stared at his screen. I could practically hear the malicious, desperate gears grinding in his head. He genuinely believed he had caught the rat. He believed my naive 19-year-old grandson was not just a rebellious addict, but a surprisingly capable amateur hacker who had somehow stumbled onto the money laundering operation and was clumsily trying to steal the cartel's funds. I watched as Julian immediately opened a heavily encrypted messaging application used exclusively for communicating with the crime syndicate's violent enforcers. He began rapidly typing a message explaining that he had definitively identified a rogue internal leak. He was preparing to hand them the address and Leo's physical location, fully intending to use the cartel's own ruthless assassins to permanently silence his stepson and perfectly cover up his own massive theft. He thought he was a strategic genius, orchestrating the perfect bloodless murder. He thought he was throwing the boy to the wolves to save his own miserable skin. But Julian did not know that the digital address the dark web hacker found was entirely fabricated. I had spent 6 hours meticulously spoofing the network logs, deliberately leaving a glaring breadcrumb trail that pointed directly to Leo's dorm room. I knew Julian would frantically try to hunt the intruder, and I handed him the exact suspect he desperately wanted to find. I sat back in my heavy chair, the cold blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. I let him press the send button. I let him invite the monsters into the light. He believed he was meticulously setting a deadly trap for my grandson, completely unaware that he was already standing neck-deep in mine. The clock on the van dashboard read 11:45 at night. Rain lashed against the windshield in violent diagonal sheets, completely obscuring the desolate industrial district of downtown Denver. I sat in the driver's seat of an unmarked, heavily modified surveillance van parked exactly 2 blocks away from an abandoned textile warehouse. Leo sat beside me. He was shivering, though I knew it was not from the cold. He stared at the glowing monitors mounted in the back of the vehicle, his breath hitching every time a shadow moved on the screen. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Grandma?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling over the steady drumming of the rain. "If this fails, they will come directly to my dormitory tonight." I did not take my eyes off the high-definition thermal imaging feed. It will not fail. Watch the screen and learn exactly how monsters are broken. I had spent the last 48 hours completely hijacking the city municipal grid for a 3-mile radius. I owned the traffic lights. I owned the closed-circuit television cameras. Most importantly, I owned the specific wireless network Julian was currently relying on inside that decaying brick building. On the main monitor, a sleek black luxury sedan rolled slowly into the dark warehouse. Julian stepped out. Even in the damp, rotting environment, he wore a sharply tailored trench coat, clutching a sleek silver tablet against his chest. He looked around nervously, his polished arrogance slightly dampened by the visceral reality of dealing with actual killers in the flesh. A second vehicle, an unremarkable gray sedan, idled silently near the loading dock. A man emerged from the shadows. He did not have a name in any database I could find. The cartel simply referred to him as a cleaner. He moved with the terrifying, predatory stillness of a man who killed for a living. No swagger, no wasted motion. He simply walked up to Julian and extended one gloved hand. My fingers hovered over my illuminated keyboard. My heart beat in a slow, icy rhythm. This was the exact moment of ignition. Julian spoke, his voice picked up perfectly by the parabolic microphone I had planted near the rafters earlier that afternoon. "Everything you need is right here," Julian said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. He handed the tablet over. The internal protocol addressed the physical dormitory location, and the digital logs proving this college kid has been actively siphoning your boss's money. Eliminate the boy tonight and the financial leak is permanently sealed. The cleaner took the device. He tapped the screen to wake it up. Inside the van, I pressed the enter key with a sharp, definitive strike. I did not just hack the local network. I had maintained a persistent, invisible back door into Julian's tablet ever since I cloned his phone at my dining table. The very second the cleaner looked down at the glowing screen, I initiated a catastrophic data overwrite. I instantly wiped the fabricated evidence pointing to Leo. In its place, I forced the tablet to play a highly specific hidden video file I had extracted from Julian's own encrypted backup drives. It was a drunken, boastful recording Julian had made months ago in his private office, likely intended for a mistress or a corrupt colleague. Suddenly, Julian's own recorded voice blasted from the tablet speakers, echoing loudly against the damp concrete walls of the warehouse. "These East Coast thugs think they are so smart." The recorded Julian laughed arrogantly on the screen, holding up a glass of expensive whiskey. "They are nothing but uneducated street trash. I am skimming their wash every single week, and the idiot boss does not even know how to read a basic balance sheet. I will drain them dry and disappear before they even figure out how to log into their own accounts." Inside the warehouse, the air instantly turned to pure ice. Julian froze. His face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. He stared at the tablet in the cleaner's hand, his brain violently misfiring as he tried to comprehend how his deepest, most fatal secret was currently broadcasting directly to the man sent to kill the thief. The cleaner did not shout. He did not ask a single question. He simply dropped the tablet onto the wet concrete floor, reached slowly under his dark jacket, and drew a suppressed, semi-automatic weapon. "No!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. "No, wait. That is a deep fake. I was hacked. The kid set me up." The cleaner raised the weapon. Julian turned and ran. He did not run like a martial arts expert. He did not run like a sophisticated Silicon Valley mogul. He ran like a terrified animal. He abandoned his expensive car, sprinting wildly into the pitch-black maze of rusted shipping containers and broken machinery. The cleaner pursued him effortlessly, a silent shadow sliding through the rain, hunting a man who had just signed his own gruesome death warrant. "He is running," Leo gasped, pressing his hands against the glass of the monitor. "They are going to kill him." "Let the wolves tear each other apart," I said coldly, turning away from the video feed. The physical chase was no longer my concern. My war was fought in the digital ether, and I had two final devastating strikes to deliver. I opened my primary command terminal. First, I accessed the Cayman Island banking portal. Using Julian's stolen credentials, I entered his master password. With 3 rapid keystrokes, I triggered a catastrophic security protocol, intentionally failing the biometric verification process 5 consecutive times. The offshore bank immediately locked the accounts. The millions of dollars he had stolen were now completely frozen, permanently trapped behind a wall of international banking red tape. Even if he somehow survived the night, he was entirely destitute. Next, I opened a secure, encrypted transmission channel directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office. I attached a massive, heavily organized data packet. It contained every single authentic ledger, every unedited corporate document, and a comprehensive timeline, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Julian had forged Clara's signature, and systematically kept her heavily drugged to act as his oblivious puppet. It was a flawless, irrefutable defense for my daughter. I hit send. The progress bar flashed green. Transmission complete. Outside, the rain continued to pour, washing away the sins of the city. Julian was currently stumbling blindly through the dark, crying out in terror as the cartel closed in. His money was gone. His freedom was gone. His carefully constructed empire was nothing but digital ash. I calmly shut down the monitors, put the van into gear, and drove my grandson quietly back to safety. A desperate animal always returns to its den. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Julian had somehow managed to evade the cartel hunters in the industrial district. He dragged himself back to his isolated suburban fortress soaked in freezing rain. His expensive trench coat ruined his mind, completely unraveling. His offshore funds were frozen. His digital empire was obliterated. He had only one move left. He needed leverage. He needed a hostage to negotiate his way out of the country, and his legally bound, heavily medicated wife was the perfect human shield. He bypassed the security keypad and violently kicked open the side entrance door. He stormed into the grand living room, dripping water onto the pristine hardwood floors, screaming Clara's name. The massive crystal chandelier suddenly flared to life, flooding the entire room with blinding light. Julian froze. I was sitting comfortably in his imported Italian leather armchair. My posture was completely relaxed. My legs crossed a steaming cup of tea resting on the small side table. "She is not going anywhere with you, Julian," I said calmly. He blinked, wiping the rainwater and cold sweat from his eyes. Then he saw her. Standing directly behind my chair was Clara. She was not slouched. Her eyes were not dull and vacant. They were sharp, focused, and burning with an absolute terrifying clarity. 2 days earlier, immediately after returning from the Sunday dinner, I had quietly initiated a rigorous medical detox. I systematically replaced every single one of his proprietary sedatives with harmless vitamin capsules. For 48 straight hours, I stayed by her side, hydrating her, walking her through the agonizing withdrawal, and finally showing her the undeniable physical evidence of exactly what her husband had done. The chemical ghost was completely gone. My fierce, independent daughter was back. Julian stared at her in utter disbelief. He realized instantly that his absolute control was broken. The pristine illusion of his domestic dominance shattered into a million jagged pieces. A primal, ugly rage twisted his handsome features. "You ruined everything!" he roared at me, his fists clenching as he fell back into his disciplined, tactical combat stance. He lunged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed, fully intending to use his advanced martial arts training to break my neck just as easily as he had broken Leo's wrist. This was his final fatal miscalculation. He genuinely believed a 49-year-old grandmother would instinctively freeze in the face of raw physical violence. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cower. I did not even blink. I calmly raised my right hand, pointing the heavy dual-barreled law enforcement-grade stun gun I had been resting quietly in my lap. I pulled the trigger. 50,000 volts of electricity slammed directly into his chest. The heavy thud of the prongs making contact was immediately followed by the loud, vicious crackle of the electric current. All the expensive martial arts training in the world cannot stop the central nervous system from completely short-circuiting. Julian's eyes rolled back into his head. His muscles locked instantly, and he crashed face first onto the expensive rug, convulsing helplessly like a dying fish. I stepped over his twitching body. I reached into his own tactical supply bag, the one he kept hidden in the hall closet, and pulled out a handful of heavy-duty industrial zip ties. I methodically secured his wrists behind his back, pulled the thick plastic tight until it dug sharply into his skin, and dragged him up into a heavy wooden dining chair, binding his ankles securely to the legs. When Julian finally regained consciousness 20 minutes later, his vision blurred. His chest heaving, he expected pain. He expected me to interrogate him or physically assault him. I simply picked up the remote control and turned on the massive television mounted on the wall. The morning news was broadcasting live. The headline banner flashed in bright red letters. Federal agents were actively swarming the glass headquarters of his biomedical startup. Agents in dark jackets were carrying out dozens of boxes of physical evidence. Right on cue, the burner phone Julian had kept tucked in his inner pocket began to vibrate violently on the coffee table in front of him. The screen lit up with a continuous, terrifying stream of encrypted messages. They were explicit, incredibly detailed death threats from the East Coast Syndicate. They knew he was broke. They knew he was exposed. Clara stepped around the armchair and walked slowly toward the man who had stolen 3 years of her life. She looked down at him not with fear, and not even with anger. She looked at him with absolute, hollow disgust. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the massive plastic bottle of the heavy sedatives he had forced down her throat, and calmly poured the hundreds of tiny white pills over his head. They bounced off his shoulders and scattered across the floor like dirty snow. "Goodbye, Julian," Clara said, her voice perfectly steady. We did not wait for his pathetic pleas. We turned our backs and walked out the front door into the crisp, clean morning air. As I climbed into my vehicle, I pulled out my secure tablet one last time. I generated 2 anonymous location pins containing the exact coordinates of the mansion. I sent the first message directly to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I sent the second message directly to the encrypted server of the criminal cartel. I put the car in drive and drove my daughter away. I left Julian tightly bound to a chair in an empty house, completely paralyzed by terror, waiting to see which pack of wolves would reach the front door first. The law or the monsters he had tried to cheat. 1 year later, the Colorado winter was finally melting into a warm spring. Leo was sitting at my kitchen island typing rapidly on his laptop. His wrist was completely healed, and his grades had earned him a spot on the university's elite academic honor roll. Clara was standing by the stove laughing as she flipped pancakes. She had legally dissolved the fraudulent startup and was now running a fully transparent, highly successful foundation dedicated to helping victims of domestic psychological abuse. I sat quietly in my favorite chair by the window, sipping a hot cup of black coffee. I looked down at the heavy oak desk. Resting right on the surface was my late husband's ancient, battered flip phone. It was completely silent now. It would never ring again. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the cold plastic, and smiled a deep, profoundly satisfied smile. I had paid the ultimate price in darkness so my family could stand securely in the light, and I would gladly burn the world down again to keep them there. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support James' Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.